subversive sequel. So here's how that works in the case of the Akedah, for example. Klitzner picks up on what she calls subtle echoes between the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, and a later biblical narrative that also focuses on a parent who's also a God-fearing man, who's also in a somewhat complicated relationship with God, and that man is Job. Abraham and Job's stories you might have never thought of before as connected to one another, but in many ways they're actually very similar, but they also differ in one really critical way. Whereas Abraham remained silent and compliant, resigned to his child's fate, Job, when facing a similar landscape of loss, turns to God in rage. Why do you hide your face? Why have you turned me into your enemy, Job says. From Job, we learn that to be God's beloved servant requires not passive acquiescence, but protest against injustice, even when that injustice is authored by God. That, in the story of Job, is actually seen as an incredible act of faith. And in the end, both the protagonist and God evolved from the problematic, simplistic outlook of the earlier narrative from the book of Genesis. Call it a subversive sequel, or I like the language of redemption narrative. And my God, it has given me so much joy to uncover this radical new take on so many of our beloved stories. Now, what often happens when you find a great teacher who has a really novel approach to something is the idea kind of seeps into your subconsciousness. And you see it everywhere. So the idea of subversive sequels became for me a frame for everything that I was seeing and encountering. I turned back to some early scholarship from the brilliant Tikva Freimer-Kensky about ancient Near Eastern mythology, in particular the epic of Atrahasis. Now, David told me to warn you that I'm feeding you the vegetables first in this sermon, so just bear with me for a minute. It's not often that the epic of Atrahasis comes up in the first 5 minutes when you're trying to hook people into what you're sharing. But in fact, this story predates the Bible by more than 700 years. And it is an eerie precursor to the Torah's version of both the creation and the flood stories in the book of Genesis. Now, the reason I'm talking about this today is because when I was in seminary, I was really convinced that in order to consider Torah in light of any of these other ancient mythologies somehow degraded the sanctity of our own text. And now I really see the opposite. So I'm going to spare you the details of the comparative analysis, but I want to tell you that it occurred to me as I read about the epic of Atrahasis that the Torah itself is a subversive sequel. It was crafted in response to the prevalent worldview of human exploitation and divine violence and callousness of the Near Eastern mythologies. The Torah instead is telling us a story of undeserved love, of covenant, of forgiveness, and human striving. Meaning this: our most sacred text is itself a polemic, a revolution against the norms of the ancient world, a new version, a different story now that's intended to inspire human beings to manifest a new and different kind of reality. Now, last month, I sat with a friend and ICAR advisory board member, Ari Wallach, just before his book, Long Path, came out. And Ari told me that the driving question of his book is how can we be the ancestors that our descendants 1,000 years from now need us to be? It was a summer of heat waves and wildfires. The tarmac in London was melting as we spoke. It was about to hit 112 degrees in Los Angeles. Roe had been overturned, and red states were lining up to pass increasingly restrictive laws criminalizing abortion and attacking bodily autonomy. The school board in Tennessee banned mouse because Spiegelman's mother's mouse breast was exposed in one image, rendering the book unfit for children. We're going to talk more about that on Yom Kippur. And there was a whirlwind of anti-LGBTQ bills that were filed over the first half of the year, most of them specifically targeting the trans community, in what amounted to a coordinated effort to eliminate trans people from public life. As we've navigated these cascading, intersecting crises, I have thought often about Dr. King's most ominous warning, which he delivered in a sermon in 1967, April, in Riverside Church in New York. He said, "Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, 'Too late.'" I thought about that as my family and I walked through the Colosseum in Rome before the ICAR Europe trip this summer. Every life eventually ends. Every empire eventually falls. At some point, it will be too late for us too. And my greatest fear over these past several years is that we are rapidly approaching the point of no return. Our descendants 1,000 years from now? I scoffed at Ari Wallach. Given the devastation to our environment, the ruptures in our democracy and our society, do you really think we'll even be around in 100 years, I said? "Ah," said Ari, "that's what progressives often do. We're so alarmed by the trends that we begin to believe that there are no alternative outcomes. But there's almost always an alternative outcome." Ari argues that where we land after times of rupture and disorder very much depends on our willingness to invest in long-term visions and dreams, even as we're being tossed around in the storm. And isn't that the very hallmark of this season? The insistence that as long as the breath of life remains in us, it's not too late for us to write our own subversive sequel, or at least to create the conditions for the next generation to do so. Dan Gilbert, who's a Harvard psychologist, writes that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think that they're finished. On some level, we think it's already over, that real change is simply no longer possible. But this is nothing more than a failure of personal imagination. We cannot imagine a different future, and therefore we assume that there can't be one. And yet I've seen again and again a counter-testimony to that kind of dead-end thinking in this very community. The estranged father who, after a lifetime of running from his family, reveals an uncharacteristic tenderness before his death, opening pathways to understanding and forgiveness with his children. The grown sisters who become best friends in adulthood, despite their mother's problematic relationship with her sister and their grandmother's with her sister. The child of abuse who grew up to be the very embodiment of maternal love. Remember, God's very name is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be. You're like me, God's saying, a work in progress. We're not done yet. It's not too late for our country, and it's not too late for you or for me. And that's why Dr. King called us to act with the fierce urgency of now, to turn the tide before it is too late. It turns out that stubbornly trusting in a better future is actually very Jewish, as Ari reminds us that as the Israelites walked through the desert for those 40 years, facing plague and war and uncertainty, it was a vision of a land flowing with milk and honey that kept them going. I caught glimpses of this kind of thinking throughout Ikar's journey through Central Europe this summer. As our group followed the train tracks into Auschwitz-Birkenau, as we wondered how could it be that any person could possibly survive such dehumanization, such cruelty, I remembered a passage from Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and enslaved laborer in that camp. He was marching with fellow prisoners one day to a work site just outside the camp, and it was bitter cold, and he was hungry, and he was broken, and he had already witnessed a lifetime of horrors, but he somehow managed to transport himself through his thoughts to another place and another time. Frankl writes, "I saw myself standing on a platform in a well-lit, warm, pleasant lecture room. In front of me sat an attentive audience in comfortable, upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. All that oppressed me in that moment became objective, seen and described from the remote viewpoint of science. And by this method, he writes, I succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the sufferings of the moment, and I observed them as if they were already of the past. This act of imagination became a lifeline for Frankl, lifting him from the hellscape of his present to a future that, while almost unimaginable, was ultimately possible. And as many of you know, astonishingly, miraculously, only 11 months after the liberation of Auschwitz, Frankl stood in a well-lit lecture hall in Vienna, and he delivered those lectures that he had recreated in his own mind, writing his own subversive sequel. One needn't have to suffer the indignities of the Shoah in order to find meaning in the practice of future orienting. It is a peculiarity of man that he can only live by looking to the future, Frankl said. The one who lost faith in the future, his future was doomed. And Frankl wasn't the only one to come to this awareness, obviously. In Warsaw, we spent an afternoon in the Oneg Shabbat archives of Dr. Emanuel Ringelbaum. In 1939, Ringelbaum and a number of colleagues began to document the reality of Jewish life under Nazi occupation. They gathered testimonies from the Jewish community, from educators and journalists, from artists and children, and they ultimately were able to capture tens of thousands of documents, written reports, everything from grocery inventories to underground newspapers to lists of names and ultimately deportation schedules. Through hunger and humiliation, through illness and grief, they became singularly focused on archiving the details of the extermination effort. And when most of the Warsaw Ghetto was deported to Treblinka in the summer of 1942, these archivists began to bury their work underground. I want to ask you to think about what that means for a moment. At that point, they were no longer writing in order to stir the conscience of the world to the atrocities that were being committed, so that maybe, God willing, help would come. They knew already at that point that no help was coming. And even still, with every ounce of energy they had, they continued to write and to bury, to write and to bury. Why did they do that? Because on some level, they knew that they would die. But they also trusted that someone someday would find what they had written and would reconstruct their lives and honor their death. Someone someday would care about what they had suffered through. After the war, portions of those archives were dug up, and those documents today are considered some of the richest testimony that we have to what our Jewish family endured during those terrible years, and to their steadfast commitment to a future that they knew they were never going to see. On our way from Auschwitz to Budapest, we spent 2 nights in Slovakia, in Kosice, where our dear Susanna grew up and her family still resides. There was once a flourishing Jewish community of 12,000 Jews before the war, 1 in every 5 residents. Nearly all of them were deported to Auschwitz. There's a big synagogue, beautiful, right in the middle of this town, and it was used during that time as a center for deportation. Thousands of Jews were crammed into that building for days to await transfer to Auschwitz. Now, for decades after the war, the synagogue sat empty and desolate. But a couple of years ago, some people entered the building in order to try to clean it up and maybe renovate. And they began to pull some of the wooden pews from the walls. And what they found was absolutely breathtaking. Tucked behind the cover of these giant wooden pews were pencil scrawlings that had been written surreptitiously by those who were awaiting deportation in that sanctuary. "We are here," they wrote. "It's 1944. We do not know where they will take us." We wept when we read those messages, the agony, the desperation, a time capsule that had remained hidden for 65 years. As nearly the entire Jewish community was murdered, a whole world disappeared. Literally, nobody left to find these hidden notes. But then there we were, generations later, a bunch of American Jews looking at a message in a bottle. And I realized that they wrote those messages, they archived those documents for us. Even as terrible as their fate was, even as death became more inescapable, we were the future that they were dreaming of. They dreamt that somehow, one day, the Jewish people would survive. And maybe some of them would care enough to come to Kosice and come sit in a synagogue. And maybe they would look behind the wooden pews and they would find those messages, and then their deaths would matter and their lives would matter too. And maybe it would somehow change us too. Maybe confronting that devastating history, reconstructing those stories would awaken us to the intimations of tyranny in our own time, to the signals all around us portending future disaster, to the ways that we so readily acclimate to racist, nationalist movements that are fueled by hatred and fear, even when they threaten our lives and our collective future, until one day it's just too late. In 1944, there was a conductor in a barrack in Auschwitz who wrote a symphony with a piece of charcoal on toilet paper. There was death all around him. For whom did he write this symphony? Surely, I imagine that creating art in that place was a stunning act of resistance and assertion of agency. It was for him, but it was also for us. It was for you, and it was for me, and it was for anyone else who would care enough to want to see that symphony played by a full orchestra one day, which it was in Israel just a couple of years ago. Because when everything else was taken from them, these people trusted on some level in a redemption narrative. They had faith that someone someday would find the remnants of their stolen lives and would write a sequel that would subvert the tragic trajectory of their story. We know that Hitler nearly achieved his goal of a Judenrein continent, a continent fully cleansed of its Jews. It wasn't only the city centers. This hit me so hard as we biked and drove through the vast and varied countryside of Europe. It was every farm and townhouse in nearly every single village across a continent. You want to understand Jewish trauma? The Nazis' fevered fixation with hunting down every last Jew so consumed them that until the end they were focusing on death marches and destroying evidence rather than pushing back against the Allied armies that were advancing on Berlin. Nearly every one of the Jews of those towns died. But we are alive. Gosha and Susanna and their families are alive, which means that this story didn't end. It means that we who are still around must continue writing the story now. And that is precisely what we're doing here today. After the devastation of the Shoah, the Jewish people desperately needed a sequel. We needed a sequel that would subvert the narrative not only of the Holocaust, but of generations of exile and persecution and oppression and genocide. We desperately needed a redemption narrative. And that is a weighty mandate. Could we transform in a hostile world Jewish dying to, even in a hostile world, Jewish thriving? Over the last 77 years, the greatest minds and hearts of our people have devoted themselves to that project. The desperate yearning to affirm Jewish vitality has led to a vibrant and diverse and flourishing American Jewish community. And the mightiest example, maybe in the history of all the Jewish people, the miraculous establishment of the State of Israel, the ultimate subversive sequel. And yet, let us be clear, we sabotage our own story when the vehicle for our redemption manifests in the dispossession of another people, the deprivation of their rights and dignities. And that's why so many people in this room work so devotedly to author a true counter-narrative to the horrors of our own past. We know that there can be no real Jewish thriving until we achieve a just shared future, not only for ourselves, but for all who dwell among us. And I know this to be possible. Of course, America, too, needs a redemption narrative. We need a subversive sequel here in this country, too. A chance to course correct, to finally lay to rest the part of our story that's rooted in greed and supremacy, in heresy and human cruelty. We need a new story, and we can write it. One thing we know, though, is that the people and the institutions that are invested in the original story will resist the sequel with every ounce of strength they have. In some cases, their insistence on the status quo, on the original being the only way, renders them prepared to destroy the whole franchise rather than share the credits. You understand what I'm saying? So they will ban books, and they will fire teachers, and they will spread lies and hate, they will threaten violence, and they will even steal voting machines, anything that they can to prevent that sequel from coming out. That's how afraid they are of the redemption narrative, a redemption narrative that shifts the power dynamic and charts a new course for us all. And the weight of their resistance to this new story might be so great that we might be tempted at times to just step back and throw up our hands and say, it is too late. We've already lost. Some of us said that this summer as we helplessly watched a dubiously constituted Supreme Court zealously strip away decades of progress and rights. We are not wrong to be alarmed. And I am afraid that one day over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of our own civilization will be written the pathetic words, too late. But it's not yet too late. As long as we cast our gaze to the milk and to the honey, we can break out of that original script. We can write a new and a better and a more just and a more inclusive story. We can protect our earth. We can build a true multiracial democracy that is rooted in equal justice, that defends the dignity of every single person, that strives to embody that great vision of beloved community. I want our descendants in 100 years or in 1,000 to look back at us and see that we did absolutely everything we could to create the conditions for a redemption narrative for us all. I want to close today with the words of Gila Zagstein, written in August of 1942 in the midst of the Warsaw Ghetto deportation. She calls this her last will and testament, and it was found among the Oneg Shabbat documents. She wrote the following: I wish to say goodbye to my friends and to my work. I'm calm now. I am destined to be killed. I'm trying to hide some of my work, which I hereby donate to the Jewish Museum to be founded in the future in order to restore pre-war Jewish culture and to learn the terrible tragedy of the Jewish community of Poland during the war. I only want my name and the name of my daughter Margalit Lichtenstein to be remembered. Margalit is my pride and joy, gifted and talented and beautiful, so much sorrow, so much pain. Be well, dear friends. Be well, my Jewish people. Never allow such destruction to happen again. Again, I ask us to think about what it means for a Jew who is about to be deported to Treblinka, about to face certain death along with her daughter and her entire community, to entrust her artwork and her daughter's memory, the two things most precious to her in this world, to a non-existent Jewish museum in an improbable, almost unimaginable Jewish future, but one that she has full faith will be built nevertheless. 2 months after I read Gila's words and I saw her artwork in a museum in Warsaw, my daughter Eva left for college. And she called me excitedly in her first week in order to tell me that she registered for the most amazing class, Exploring Yiddish Land. So Eva went to Jewish high school right here in this building. So I have to admit that I was a little bit disappointed when I first heard this. It's just one class. But I had hoped that college was going to broaden her scope of interest and understanding. And to be honest, this felt a little bit narrow, a little bit familiar. But then I read the description of the course. This course will center on Yiddish art and culture and literature that blossomed in Poland before the Holocaust. And I realized in that moment that my kid right now is fulfilling Gila Zagstein's final wish, because her beautiful Margalit could not. And that, it's very clear to me, is some kind of redemption narrative, or at the very least, an incredible blessing. I wish you all Shana Tova.
You save my life every night. You take my pain away. Lift me high when I die. You make me want to cry. You make me feel alive. You bring me round when I'm down. You take my away. Lift my eyes through blue skies. You make me want to cry. Make me feel alive. Alive.
We're about to hear the shofar, which our rabbis teach is the most crucial commandment of the day. But before we do, we're going to say a bracha, or a blessing. Blessed is God who sanctified us through mitzvot and commanded us to hear kol shofar. This is often translated as the sound of the shofar. However, kol in Hebrew also means voice. With that framework, it's a pretty incredible voice, if you think about it. It's an unlikely voice that comes from the horn of a ram. Every year, the shofar, the voice of the shofar is just a little different, as is every single shofar. And as far as I know, there isn't a way to choose the pitch or timbre either. It's this natural, raw voice that sometimes sounds a little broken, like our shavarim blast, and sometimes it sounds whole, like the tikiyah blast. And if you're like me, the shofar's voice stirs my true, raw, real voice to be awakened. What if we let the shofar activate our raw, real, true voice deep inside of us to be awakened today? As we listen to the shofar in a few moments, close your eyes. Let this voice wash over your body. And may the shofar open us up to the possibilities of what this year could be for us if we always strive to let our raw, real, beautiful voices ring out for the world to see. We're on page 119. I invite you to rise in every way you are able.
מן המיצר קראתיה, ענני במרחביה. קולי שמעת, אל תלם אוזנך, לרווחתי, לשוועתי. ראש דבורכו אמת, ולעולם משפט צדקך. הרוב עבדך לטוב, אל יקשוני זדים. שש אנוכי על אמרתך, כמוצאי שלל רב. טוב טעם ודעת למדני, כי במצוותיך האמנתי. נדבתי רצון אדוני, ומשפטיך למדני. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו, וציוונו לשמוע קול שופר. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
Shevarim Truah. Shevarim Truah. Shivarim.
אשריים יוני תרועה אדוני, יור פניך יעליכון, איי 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 איי
Page 121.
Page 123.
Amen.
I'm going to have you stay standing. I'm going to say a quick word before we transition into Musaf and our Amidah, which means standing. So I have no idea how to paddleboard, and I discovered this while on a paddleboard on a lake last month. I went out by myself. I awkwardly dragged the board into the water. I managed to climb on without falling, and I paddled kind of. I made my way out into the middle of the lake, and there it was quiet. The people who were on the dock, their voices faded. And I very carefully stopped, and I lay down on the paddleboard in the middle of that lake and looked up at the stunning clear sky, and I breathed, and I found stillness. I'm not sure if it was 5 seconds or 30 seconds or 5 minutes. In some ways, it doesn't matter. Perhaps you can think of a similar experience. Maybe it was on a lake, maybe it was on a mountain somewhere, standing at the edge of the ocean. And in a moment, we're heading into the Musaf Amidah. We're going to take some time for personal prayer and for quiet. And I often feel like the quiet of this Amidah is somehow quieter in contrast to the shofar blasts that we just heard. And I want you to know that almost nobody in this room knows what they're doing right now. For the words of the High Holiday Amidas. Unless you have led these services, it's really hard to remember these from year to year, even if you have led them. And so we're all kind of paddling out there a little bit, awkwardly, not 100% sure or even 5% sure what we're doing, but we're doing it. And we get there. And we use the words, or we whisper the words coming from our heart, whichever helps you find some motion and some movement. And I want to invite you at some point during this time to pause and find yourself at least one moment of stillness. And close your eyes and put a talit over your head. And perhaps in doing so, we'll find a little bit of extra peace to carry us through today and this holy season. So the silent Amidah begins on page 125. Chatzi Kaddish begins on page 123.
Figuring it out.
יתקדם ויתקדם שמי רבה ויאמר יברך ירוסנו וימליך מלכותנו
wondering why we're giving you delicious snacks if you're on your way out the door. Okay, so I'll tell you the thinking. We hope you're going to stick around. No guilt if you need to go, but this is not only a time for a little bit more silence and deepening of some of the spiritual work we started, but also some of the most incredible and powerful moments of the entire year in terms of liturgy that happen in Musaf now. And I'm not just trying to give it a hard sell, it's actually true. So if you got it in you, we'd love for you to stay and join us. First, a silent Amidah that begins on page 125. We'll take a few moments of quiet, and then we'll come together for some of these extraordinary moments.
השומע תפילת עמך ישראל ברחמים, ברוך אתה שומע תפילה.
Repetition of Musaf begins on page 141.
Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Abraham Elohei Sarah Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Rivka Elohei Yaakov Elohei Leah הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון. גומל חסדים טובים וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו מסוד חכמים ונבונים ומלמד מבינים, אויב תחפני בתפילה ובתחנונים, לכלות ולכונן פני מלך מלכי מלכים ואדוני אדונים.
You can have a seat.
זוכרנו לחיים, דרך חפץ בחיים, וכותבנו בספר החיים, וכותבנו בספר החיים, למענך אלוהים חיים, מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם. אמן. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע, מוריד הטל, נכלכל חיים וחסד, לחיי מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נפלים ורפא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומחיים אמונתם לאיש
נאמנת להחיות מתים. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים. ובכן ולכת עלי קדושה כי אתה אלוהינו מלך מלכי וסולח.
I want to call your attention to, I want to celebrate two masterpieces of Jewish literature, two awesome and terrifying pieces of Jewish literature. And the first one is the very next section of our prayers, Unatane Tokef. Unatane Tokef, if you've read it before, maybe you're wondering why I'm celebrating it, why I would call it a masterpiece. Because it is a disturbing prayer that speaks of God as judge, jury, and executioner, that decides who will live and who will die. And many people have told me, this is the part of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah that I simply cannot stand. It's exactly this kind of messaging that makes me recoil. As I was reading through it last night, I remembered another great Jewish piece of writing that also deals with a legalistic metaphor and also suggests that perhaps we are doomed. And that is a short piece by Franz Kafka called Before the Law. It's short, but I'm not going to read it all, but let me just read you the beginning. Before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper, there comes a countryman and prays for admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot grant admittance at the moment. The man thinks it over and then asks if he will be allowed in later. It is possible, says the doorkeeper, but not at the moment. Since the gate stands open, as usual, and the doorkeeper steps to one side, the man stoops to peer through the gateway into the interior. Observing that, the doorkeeper laughs and says, if you're so drawn to it, just try to go in despite my veto. But take note, I am powerful, and I am only the least of the doorkeepers. From hall to hall, there is one doorkeeper after another, each more powerful than the last. The third doorkeeper is already so terrible that even I cannot bear to look at him. These are difficulties the countryman has not expected. The law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. And we are the countrymen, aren't we? What is going on here? What theology is this? What master stands behind all of this? Surely we should all be able to cross over. Surely we should all be able to get inside. And if you asked Franz Kafka, what's going on here? I cannot stand this message. I am disturbed by this. I think he would say, yes, exactly. I mean for you to be disturbed. Because there are some truths that cannot be told, some feelings that cannot be felt without chilling you to the bone. Let me read just one more sentence. The man waits and waits and waits until he's dying. And then finally, he asks, everyone strives to reach the law. So how does it happen for all these many years that no one but myself has ever begged for admittance? The doorkeeper recognizes that the man has reached his end, and to let his failing senses catch the word roars in his ears. No one else could ever be admitted here, since this gate was made only for you. I am now going to shut it. Unatane Tokef begins on page 143.
ונתן תוקף קדושת היום, כי הונו רביום, ובוא תנשא מלכותך, לכון בחסד כיסך, ותשב עליו באמת. באמת כי אתה יודע נמוכך, ויודע ותזכור כל הנשכחות, ותפתח את ספר הזיכרונות ומעליו יקרא, וחותם יד כל אדם בו. ובשופר גדול ייתקע, וכל דממה דקה יישמע, נו מלכים יחפשון, וכאילו ליד לבכות על צבא מרום מדהים, כי לא יזכו בעיניך בדין. לכל באי עולם יעברון לפניך, כי בני מרון. איי איי וראש השנה יקטנו, ויום צום כיפור יחתנו. וראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. כמה יעברון וכמה יבריון, נחיה ומי ימות, מי בקיצו ומי לא בקיצו, מי באש ומי במים, מי בחרב ומי בחיה, מי בדם ומי בצמא. לראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. לראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. מי ברש ומי במגפה, מי בחניקה ומי בסקילה. בראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. בראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. מי ינוח ומי ינוע, מי שקט ומי יתערב, מי שלב ומי יתייסר, מי יהיה עני ומי יהיה אשר, מי ישפר ומי ירום. בראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. בראש השנה יקטנו, וביום צום כיפור יחתנו. ותשובה קשה לכעוס ונוח לרצות כי לא תחפוץ במות המת אם בשובו בדרכו בחיה ביד יום אותותיך כלא אם ישוב מיד תקבלו אמת כי אתה יצרם ואתה יוצא יצרם כי הם בשר ודם אדם יסודו מיפק נפשו יבלך משהו כחסר נשפק חבק בורח ואתה הוא מלך אל חי וקיים אין קצבה לשנותיך ואין קץ לאורך ימיך ואין שיעור למרכבות כבודיך ואין פירוש לעילום שמך נאי שמך נאו אליך ואתה נאו אל שמך ושמנו איי 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 קראת בשמך עשה למען שמך וקדש את שמך על מקדישי שמך בעבור כבוד שמך הנערת והמקדש.
Turn to page 145 for Kedusha.
נערית חי ונקדישך כתוציח שרפי קודש המקדישים שמך בקודש דרם עליהם דרם אתה ככתוב על ירמיך וקרא זה אל זה ויאמר קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך הארץ כבודו בשמיים ביבש מה אומרים? מה ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד. נו אלוהינו הוא אבינו מלכנו ומושיענו והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנית לעיני כל חי להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם אדיר אדירנו אדוני אדוננו מדיר שמך בכל הארץ והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור ימלוך אדוני לאלוהי ציון לדור ודור הללויה לדור ודור נגיד גודלך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש לדור ודור נגיד גודלך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד כי למלך גדול וקדוש אתה גדם די די גדם די די גדם די די גדם די
You can have a seat.
עמול על מעשיך ותשמח במעשיך ויאמרו לך חוסיך בצדקך עמוסיך
תודה
על כל מעשיך כי מקדישך בקדושתך קידשת נאוהל קדוש בעיר מקדושים
Turn to the bottom of page 148. Tuskav levadecha.
ושכב לבדיך ותמלוך על כל בייחוד ככתוב על ידך והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד ובכן תן פחדך אדוני אלוהינו על כל מעשיך בהמתך על כל מה שבראת ויראוך כל המעשים וישתחוו לפניך כל הברואים ויעשו כולם אגודה ואחד לעשות רצונך בלבב שלם כמו שידענו אדוני אלוהינו שהשלטון לפניך עוז בידיך ורבי מיניך ושמך נורא על כל מה שבראת תן כבוד אדוני לעמך תהילה לירך ותקווה לדורשך ופתחון פה למייחלים לך שמחה לארצך וששון לעירך ושמיכת קטן לדוד עבדך ואריכות נר לבן ישי משיחך במהרה בימינו ובכן צדיקים יראו וישמחו וישרים יעלוזו וחסידים בדינה יגידו ועולתה תקפוץ פיה, וכל הרישה כולה כעשן תכלה, כי תבא ממשל זדון מן הארץ.
One of my earliest e-car memories is Rosh Hashanah, and I'd never been to Rosh Hashanah here before, and all of these friends I had made tried to pull me up to some kind of weird gathering over here to dance and jump, and I was so confused, and I refused to join them. Since then, I've learned better. We're about to go into V'yetayu this morning, which has become famous here as the mosh pit prayer, the one where Rabbi Kasher jumps into a crowd, the most raucous one, the one that felt most jarring to do alone in our homes. But what is it actually? What's it about? Why do we have so much joy here? Especially when we look out at the world and it feels so dark. It feels so bad. Climate devastation, continued rise of white nationalism, the vicious attack on reproductive rights from the highest courts, the endless gun violence, even this week the continued protests in Iran over the death of Mahsa Amini for not appropriately covering her hair. What are we supposed to do with all of this? How are we supposed to find hope? Rabbi Browse talked about that just a little while ago, and it's a struggle for all of us. Where do we find hope? How do we find this joy? And the writer and historian Rebecca Solnit has a book, a collection of essays called Hope in the Dark. Pretty straightforward what she's going for there. And she talks about exactly this question. She says that often what happens is we confuse the darkness of the future for something that's terrible when the reality is it's just inscrutable. She says that we transform the unknowability of the future into something certain that contains all of our dread. But she says clearly, again and again and again, weirder things happen than the end of the world. Weirder things happen. V'yetayu invites us into that reality. What else might happen other than darkness and suffering and trauma and the end of the world? The uncertainty of the future is actually the thing, Solnit reminds us, that carves out space for hope. We don't know, and because of that, we can imagine. What does that imagining, what does that hope look like and feel like for you? What world can you imagine on the other side of all of the darkness in front of us? What can this uncertainty allow you to envision? V'yetayu is a moment to dream. What weirder thing can you think about that's going to happen other than the end of the world? Let's celebrate that weirdest, best vision you can muster from deep inside yourselves. Let's dance about it. V'yetayu is on page 150.
Please rise.
ויתיו כל עובדיך ויברכו שם כבודיך ויגידו וואי צדקך שכם אחד לעבדיך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ברוחוים שבשבונך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ויכירו כוח מלכותך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ילמדו תורים בינה.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
וימוללו את גבולתך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ונפשך מתנשא לכל ערום.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ויסתולדו בחילה לפניך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ויעטרוך נזרת תפארה.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ויצלחו פנים מינה.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ויצאו אלוהים במוחך.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
וקבלו מלכותך עליהם.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
ונאמנוך בקהלה.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
וישמיעו נחקקים ויבואו.
וייתנו לך כתם אלוהיך.
See what we're saying about American Jewry? Alive and well, here we are, people.
חיים לא חד עלי לעולם לא ציון לדור ודור הללויה
On page 151.
קדוש אתה ונורא שמך ואין אלוה מבלעדיך ככתוב ויקבע אדוני צבאות במשפט והאל הקדוש נקדש בצדקה ברוך אתה אדוני המלך הקדוש אתה בחרתנו מכל העמים אהבת אותנו ורצית בנו ורוממתנו מכל הלשונות וקידשתנו במצוותיך וקרבתנו מכנו לעבודתך בשמך כבוד הקדוש שלנו קראת ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה את יום הזיכרון הזה יום תרועה מקרא קודש זכר יציאת מצרים.
Turn to the middle of the next page.
You can have a seat if you'd like for a moment. I always felt like davening should work up a sweat a little bit, so we're about to go into Aleinu. And in preparation for High Holy Days this year, we told you a very old story. It was the story of Rabban Gamliel, who's out on a journey when he witnesses from afar a shipwreck. And with dread, he realizes that his very dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Akiva, is on that ship that was destroyed. And so Rabban Gamliel is plunged into grief. He's devastated by the loss of his friend. He returns home to share the terrible news with the rest of the community. But then a short time later, he's completely stunned when Rabbi Akiva shows up before him ready to learn Torah as if nothing at all had happened. And Rabban Gamliel, as you may recall, says to him, "What happened? Who brought you up from the water?" And Rabbi Akiva explained that when the entire ship was destroyed, a plank from the broken ship floated by, and with all of his might, he grabbed a hold of it. And holding on tight, he says, he bowed his head with each wave that came toward him. That boat plank that he held onto so tightly is called in Hebrew a daf shel sfina. It did not keep Rabbi Akiva from being pulled under the water again and again, but it did ensure that he would make his way back up to the surface. It gave him the support that he needed to catch his breath until he could rediscover his own strength and swim back to shore. In this moment, I want to ask you to hold the truth of this story. We all work so hard to bring a measure of control into our lives, to protect the people we love, to try to create some stability amidst the storm of our time. And yet we keep getting reminded that no amount of will, no amount of preparation, no amount of power or even money can keep the ship from wrecking, because life is unkind, unfair, and unpredictable sometimes. So 3 times a year, we come to this place and we recognize our powerlessness. We actually put our entire bodies fully on the ground, and we humbly assert our own limitations. We submit to the power of the rocks that are smashing against the boat's side. And I want to invite us all to do this, every one of us who's physically able, especially the cynics and the skeptics and the people who are most averse to this message, because we are the ones who need it the most. But then we do something astonishing, something audacious and intrepid. We get back up on our feet. And here I want to ask you to consider this year that how we rise when we have been brought low matters and matters profoundly. Rabbi Akiva survived by grabbing onto that daf shel sfinah, that plank of wood, and holding it for dear life. He trusted that the plank's buoyancy would bring him back up to the surface. We all have dapim shel sfinah. We all have planks that are floating all around us that we hold on to when the ship is smashed to pieces and we know that our own strength is not enough to keep us afloat. So today, when we get up from the ground, I want to invite us to lift each other up, as we have again and again in the hardest moments, symbolizing that collectively not one of us can rise alone. And then we stand with our arms overhead, embodying the triumph of the Spirit that brings us back up again and again. I invite you to please turn to page 154. You can spread out, find a little space for yourself so that we can go into Aleinu.
Aleinu l'shameyo l'adon nakol matet gidula leyotzeh Sanu kegoye aratzon, nelo samanu kemishbechot adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kaem, vegoraleinu kechol amona. לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך
You can have a seat. We continue on 156.
כתוב בתורתך למלוך לעולם ועד, ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור, שאו שערים ראשיכם, וינשאו פתחי עולם, ויבוא מלך הכבוד. מי זה מלך הכבוד? אדוני עזוז וגיבור, אדוני גיבור מלחמה. שאו שערים ראשיכם, ושאו פתחי עולם, ויבוא מלך הכבוד. מי זה מלך הכבוד? אדוני צבאות ומלך הכבוד. סלה. לא יודע עבדך נביאים כתוב לאמור, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד. ושמו ובתורתך כתוב לאמור, שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני מלוך על כל העולם כולו בכבודך, וינשא על כל הארץ ביקרך, ויופע בהגונזך על כל יושבי טבע ארצך, וידע כל פיור כי אתה פעלתו, ויבין כל יצור כי אתה יצרתו, ויאמר כל אשר נשמה ואפו, אדוני אלוהי ישראל מלך ומלכותו, וכל משלה. קודשנו במצוותיך, ותן חלקנו בתורתך, שבינו מטובך, שמחנו משועתך, ותעל ליבנו לעבדך באמת, כי אתה אלוהים אמת ודברך, אמת וקיים לעד, ברוך אתה אדוני, מלך על כל הארץ.
Please rise. Tekiah. Shavarim Truah. Tekiah. Tekiah. Shavarim. Tekiah. Tekiah. Teruah. Tekiah.
Hayom, hayom, arat olam, hayom, yimel mishpat, orei olam, degevanim, ve'avanim, degevanim, rachamim, verachem havanim, תפננו ותוציך אור משפטנו, היום קדוש ארץ שפתנו, בכל יחור רם ונישא, ארץ שפתנו בכל יחור רם ונישא, מבינו מבין מקשיב לכל תקיעה, תקיעתנו, ברחמים וברצון, סדר מלכויותינו.
On page 160.
You can have
אתה זוכר מעשה עולם ופוקד,
You may be
כל יצור, קדם לפניך כל דגלות תלמוד, למען יתרות שמי בראשית, אין שיחה לפני כבודך, ואין נסתר בנגד עיניך. אתה זוכר כל המפעל וגם ליצור, ולא נכחד ממך, הכל גלוי ודעו לפניך, לאלוהינו צופה ומביט על סוף כל דורות, כי תביא חוק זיכרון, ויפקד כל רוח בנפש, תזכר מעשים רבים, והמון בריאות לאין תכלית, מראשית כזאת הודעת, ומלפנים אותה גילית, זה היום תחילת מעשיך זיכרון, ביום ראשון.
161.
ככתוב בתורתך, ויזכור אלוהים את נוח ואת כל החיה ואת כל התמה אשר איתו בטבע, ויעבור אלוהים רוח על הארץ, וישוקו כל המים, ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור, זכר עשה לנפלאותם, חנון ורחום אדוני. ועל ידי עבדיך הנביאים כתוב לאמור, הלוך וקראת בבני ירושלים לאמור, כה אמר אדוני, זכרתי לך חסד נעורייך, אהבת כלולותייך, לכתך אחרי במדבר, בארץ לא זרוע. אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, זוכרנו בזיכרון טוב לפניך, ופקדנו בקריאת ישוע ברחמים משמי קדם, וזכור לנו על אלוהינו תביט בחסד, ואת השבועה שנשבעת לאברהם אבינו בהר המוריה, ותראה לפניך עקדה שכתב אברהם אבינו, את יצחק בנו על גבי המזבח, וחווה שורה חמיו לעשות רצונך בלב שלם. כן יכבשו רחמך את כסך מעלינו, ובטובך הגדול ישוב חלון אבך מעמך, ומערך ומנחלתך. לקיים לנו אדוני אלוהינו את הדבר שהבטחתנו בתורתך על ידי משה עבדך מפי כבודך כאמור, וזכרתי להם ברית ראשונים אשר הוצאתי אותם מארץ מצרים לעיני הגויים להיות להם לאלוהים, אני אדוני. כי זוכר כל הנשכותיו מעולם, והנשיכה לפני חסד כבודך ועקדת יצחק לזרעו היום, ברחמים תזכור ברוך אתה אדוני. זוכר הברית.
Please rise. Tekiah. Shavarim Truah. Tekiah. Tekiah. Shavarim. Tekiah. Tekiah. Teruah. Tekiah.
היום העולם, היום ימיד למשפט, כל יצורי עולמים, עם גוונים, עם גוונים, עם גוונים, רחמנו, כרחם העולמים, בין גוונים בינינו, תכוננו ותוציך אור משפטנו, היום קדוש הרשת פתני יברב פני רב ניסה, מי בינו מעזים, בינו מקשיב לכל תשקיעותינו, תקבל רחמים ורצון סרט ומחליף.
You can have a seat. We're on page 164.
אתה נגלית בענן כבודך, עולם קודשך דבר עמם, מן השמיים נשמעתם קולך, ונגלית עליהם בארץ לתואר, וגם כל העולם כולו חל מפניך, ובריות בראשית חורדו ממך, וגלותך מלכנו על הר סיני, ללמד למך תורה מצוות, ותשמיעם את הוד קולך, ודברות קודשך מלהבות אש, וקולות וברקים עליהם נגלית, ובקול שופר עליהם הופעת. הכתוב בתורתך, ויהי קול שופר, הלוך וחזק מאוד, משה ידבר, ואלוהים יעננו בקול. ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור.
165.
Alleluia, Hallelujah, אשור וינידחים בארץ מצרים, ובאו העובדים בארץ אשור וינידחים בארץ מצרים, וישתחוו לשם בהר הקודש, וישתחוו בהר הקודש, וישתחוו לשם בהר הקודש, וישתחוו לשם בהר הקודש. ירושלים, 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 Yerushalayim, 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 Yerushalayim.
Top of page 166.
Eloheinu Avotenu tikah בשופר גדול לחירותנו ושנס תכבס גלויותינו וקרב בזורנו מבין הגויים ולפוטותינו כנת מירכי ירד ויביאנו לציון עירך ברינה ולירושלים מקדשך בשמחת עולם ששם עשו אבותינו לפניך נטולותיהם ושלמיהם וכן כתוב בתורתך וביום שמחתכם ובמועדיכם ובראשי חודשיכם תקעתם בחצוצרות על עולותיכם ועל זבחי שלמיכם והיו לכם לזיכרון לפני אלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם כי אתה שומע כל שופר ומאזין תשועה ואין דומה לך ברוך אתה אדוני שומע כל תשועת עמו ישראל ברחמים
תקיעה, שברים תשועה, תקיעה, תקיעה, שברים, תקיעה, תקיעה, תרועה, תקיעה גדולה.
הרי ששפתנו ירב לפניך אל רם ונישא הרי ששפתנו ירב לפניך אל רם ונישא מבין ומאזין מביט ומקשיב לכל תקיעתנו מבין ומאזין מביט ומקשיב לכל תקיעתנו מקבל ברחמים וברצון סדר שופרותיך.
You can have a seat. We're on page 167.
רצה אדוני אלוהינו ממך ישראל ובתפילתם שבת עבודה לביתך ותפילתם באהבה תגבה ברצון ותהי לרצון תמיד עבודת ישראל עמך ותחזינה עינינו בשובך לציון ברחמים ברוך אתה אדוני המחזיר שכינתו לציון מודים אנחנו לך. הטוב כי לא חל רחמך והמרחם כי לא תמו חסדיך מעולם קיווינו לך ועל כולם נתברך ותרומם שמך מלכנו תמיד עולם ועד נבינו מלכנו זכור רחמך וכבוש חסך וחל דבר בחרב הרעב ושבי ומשחית ועוון ושמד ומגפה ופגע בכל מחלה בכל תקלה לכל קטטה לכל מיני פורענויות לכל גזירה רעה ושנאת חינם מעלינו ומעל כל בני בריתך ומעל כל העולם נוכתב לחיים טובים כל בני בריתך לכל החיים ידעוך סלע ויעלו את שמך באמת אל ישועתנו בעזרתנו סלע ברוך אתה אדוני הטוב שמך ולכון ולהודו
169.
אלוהינו לאבותינו ברכנו בברכה משלשת בתורה כתובה על ידי משה עבדך אמורה מפי אהרון וברב כהנים עם קדושך כאמור יברכך אדוני ישמרך כן יהי רצון
Turn to page 170 for Hayom. Please rise.
Hayom, 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 hayom teyamseinu. Amen. Hayom, 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 hayom tevachenu. Amen. Hayom, 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 hayom vegodlenu. Amen. Hayom, 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 tidreshenu letova. Amen. Hayom, 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 תכתבנו לחיים טובים. אמן. היום, 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 רצון את תפילותינו. אמן. היום, 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 Shabbatenu. Amen. Hayom, 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 תתמכנו במין צדקך. אמן. כי היום הזה תפינוס תשימו שמחים בבניין שלם, ככתוב על עניך והביאותי מעל קודשי, ושימחתי בבית תפילתי, הבאתי בית תפילה יקרב. משתקה וברכה ורחמי וחיים ושלום, יהיה לנו לפני שלום. ברוך אתה אדוני, נושא השלום.
Shalom is on page 171.
יתגדל ויתקדש
שמי רבה אמן ויעלמה דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי וחייך וליום ימכון וחיי בכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן אמן שמי רבה מברך לעולם יומי יומיה יתברך יתברך וישתבח ליבו ויתרום וינשא ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי לקודשה אלא ליבו ברכת שירתה תשבחת ונחמת תמידה מעולמה
יתקבל תלותון ובאותון בכל ישראל קדם עבורם למשמיה ואמרו אמן יש לומר רבה משמיה לחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן עושה שלום לרומא הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל
Page 173, Alenu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהן, וגור עלינו ככל עמונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא.
Hashem
may be seated. Rosh Hashanah is said to be the birthday of the world, and all the more so on a day like today. All the hope of a new year also comes with the pain and sadness of entering the year without the ones we've lost, particularly if this is the first Rosh Hashanah without a loved one. The day is even more bittersweet. May you carry the spirit of those who are no longer with us into this year, and may you find comfort as you continue to traverse and build this new world without them. For those of you who are in a period of mourning, we invite you to rise in every way you're able. The Mourner's Kaddish is on page 174.
ויתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. בעלמא דיברה קראותי וימליך מלכותי. בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. מעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו. אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך בעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו. לעילה ולעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה. לאמירן באומה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה משמיה. וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום ממרומיו. הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Amen. Please stand, we'll say a closing blessing. Eloheinu v'Elokei avotinu v'imotenu. Please, God, inscribe us in the book of life and grant us in this new year a life of peace, a life of goodness, a life of health, a life of wonder, a life of connection and community, a life of honor, a life of love, a life of love, a life of love. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to welcome this new year together. Please hold us all in your love. And let us say, Shana Tova U'Mituka.
Whoa, whoa,
Turn the mic on.